A lot of people are throwing around a lot of opinions about the Sony A9, and I figured I'd just add my 2 cents to it. Um, it seems like both Sony and a lot of people that are talking about this lens are thinking of it as predominantly a sports photography lens. And when we think about that, there's a lot of issues, and this kind of struck me at the time, and it took me a while to work out because really it's a systemic issue. It's an issue with the system that Sony has right now. The A9 doesn't have the lenses, it doesn't have the accessories, and what I mean by that is like the D1, the 1D X Mark II and the Nikon D5 both have CFast cards, and there is a version of the D5 with XQD cards as well. But a lot of the photography that is happening on these cameras is happening via CFast cards, and CFast cards are expensive. They're rather expensive, and what that means is that a lot of professional photographers have invested in CFast cards, and thereby they don't have SD cards for their working photography. And what that means is that it would be fairly expensive to replace those in terms of like a cost benefit type of thing, you know, because they've sunk hundreds and hundreds of dollars into these CFast cards, and now they're being asked, if they were to switch to the A9 or being forced to or whatever by whoever they worked for, to buy into SD cards. And even if that's just, you know, the house that's renting them to them, or the agency that they're working for, the publication they're working for, it's still expensive for that body, you know, like it's going to still require somebody to cough up that money, and if that's an additional cost that they're going to be taking into account, that might not be something that they're particularly interested in. Sony has started their pro support pretty well, with 1-day loaners, 2-day repairs, or whatever it is, and that's very important, but it's not enough. For the Olympics, for the Olympics in Rio, for example, Canon brought a huge amount of both bodies and lenses to that event for photographers who needed replacements right there and then. And Sony doesn't have that, and Sony needs to have that before they can be reliable as someone that these professional organizations can be working with and professional photographers can be working with. Something like getting this whole new kit from scratch in terms of professional sports photography for the A9 would be right around $20,000, in excess of $20,000, between like 20 and 25. It'd be closer to 11 if you sold all of your Canon gear as a sports photographer to get the exact equivalents. And it would be potentially even cheaper if you bought used. However, there are some equivalents that don't exist. So there's a 16-35 f4 for Sony and a 16-35 2.8 for Canon. There is no 300 f2.8 or 500 f4, I believe, from Sony. There is from Canon and Nikon, and there's obviously a 16-35 2.8 from Nikon as well. However, it could be a lot cheaper if you picked up a couple of bodies and adapters selling the bodies off. The thing that a lot of people aren't taking into consideration when they're thinking about these sports photographers is that these sports photographers don't actually frequently own their own gear. Their gear is given to them by whomever it is that they work for, and whomever it is that they work for those are the people that are actually buying the kit, buying the gear for them. You know, they have input. They can say, I really need this thing. I really need faster cards. I really need this particular lens. I really need this particular body. And that'll be great. So those photographers don't actually have to foot those bills more often than not. However, someone does, and that someone already has bought very heavily in to one system or another. And so it will be convincing them that is the difficulty there, especially when per photographer it could cost up to, $25,000, $26,000 just to make this system switch, this unproven system switch without the same level of pro support. However, I think what a lot of people are missing out on is the idea that the Sony A9 can be used for wedding and event and portrait photography. I'm going to start with portrait photography because I think that's the one that a lot of people are like, really? About that I would be if I hadn't thought about it quite a bit. And the reason for that is that you have a zero blackout viewfinder. And that's fantastic for portrait photography because oftentimes you really got to capture that one expression just as quick as you can. And so oftentimes that 20 frames per second will be overkill, but on the other side, really in that decisive moment, you might need 20 frames per second to get 2 or 3 frames of that exact right expression. That exact right, angle of the light before a cloud or whatever, assuming you're shooting outside. And so I think that there's a lot of value in the A9 as a portrait photographer's camera. I think for wedding and event, kind of bunching those together, there are particular moments that you definitely need to capture as either a wedding or an event photographer. And when you consider those as the same thing, it's even more true because both of those types of events rather, have culminations. And you need to get that culmination, and you really only have one chance. It's, once in a lifetime. It's not perhaps once in a lifetime in terms of momentousness, but it is in terms of when you need to get the shot. And so 20 frames per second, zero blackout, fantastic. The new 100 to 400 with its exceptional focusing ability, according to Tony Northrup, at like 1/1000th of a second at ISO 25,600, it could still capture, it can still autofocus perfectly. And this was like at night. I think it was, or maybe it was f/16 or something. It was something fairly difficult, fairly substantial challenge for the camera. So I think that that value added by, it was f5.6, that was my bad. That value added for that particular lens in terms of capturing that decisive moment is key. The other G Master lenses are fantastic. I think I want to go back a step here though and start talking again about that 16 to 35 2.8 that Sony doesn't have. I think Sony will have to introduce that lens, and I think that lens is equally as important for a lot of sports photographers as it is for event and wedding photographers, because you oftentimes need to capture a bigger scope, or you need to get closer in than a large telephoto lens will provide, and it'll give you better perspective. At the very least, it also doubles as a standard length lens when you don't have your 24 to 70 easily accessible. And so I think that between the 24 to 70, the 70 to 200, the 85, and the 100, those lenses make the A9 an ideal camera for wedding and event photography. That's where I think more of its users are going to be starting at, if that makes any sense. I think more users will be buying because they are wedding photographers, event photographers, portrait photographers, travel photographers, even because it's more rugged, more weather sealed, more protected against the elements than other similar body design cameras that Sony's made, specifically the A7 series and A7 II series. So that's A7 II, A7R2, A7S2. I think as well that there will be some adoption in the sports photography community, but I think that's going to start lower down instead of the big people, ESPN, NBC, CBS, ABC. I think that's here in America, BBC. There are other international publications and journalism bits that I think will eventually adopt the Sony system. I think that even with the battery attachment, the battery grip, the A9 is about half the size of the D5 and the 1DX Mark II, and that's a really attractive feature, in my opinion, for a lot of those photographers, because it can be very difficult to get all that kit onto a plane and a carry-on, a 16 to 35, a 70 to 200, a 300 mil, f2.8 or longer, and a couple of, if not like 3 very large DSLR bodies. I think if you can have 3 A9s with battery grips with a 70 to 200, a 16 to 35, and hopefully Sony introduces a longer lens, that will allow, with Sony's idea of making those lenses very small. I mean, the 100 to 400 is actually smaller than their 70 to 200 2.8, and their 70 to 200 2.8 is about the same size as their 70 to 200 f4. I think that adherence to that that aesthetic and to that value added by a compact size is going to win the day when these photographers need something in terms of sports photography. I think that size will allow them to go more places and do more things and be more flexible on their assignments than these really huge bodies are going to give them the flexibility to do. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention. Please check out the links in the description. I really appreciate your spending your time with me today, and I hope to see you in the next one. Happy